So first things first, in this our kind of backwards video, best to take this air filter intake bit off, screw there and it pulls out. I'm going to put a bottle down the bottom as elsewhere, drain the coolant out, comes out quicker when you take the coolant cap off. The next thing you're going to do is going to take that screw off there, 10mm, and that bracket, and then you're going to put a 14mm spanner on the tensioner at the back, push down on it, get the serpentine belt off, and do yourself a big favour, make a good mental note, maybe even make a drawing of how it goes back on the pulleys, because it's yeah, can cause some more swearing. Undo the top alternator bolt, take it right out. At this point you can lever the alternator forward, which is what my little nice piece of hardwood's for. Lever him forward, then get to the bolt at the bottom, swing the alternator out, disconnect the wire at the bottom. Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention is disconnect the battery. You should always do that anyway. You can muck around with anything on a car really. And then you're going to start taking the alternator. Once you've got the alternator hanging out of the way, carefully to one side, then you're going to start taking the bolts off the water pump. Trust me, this is not a quick job. I'm pretty experienced, and it took me a good 4.5 to 5 hours. What with rounded off bolts and all that, and yeah, half an hour for lunch. But I'm now going to refill it with coolant, and hopefully the job's a good one. Right, tools needed for this mission: you want a 14mm socket on the on a 1/2" breaker bar, because the top alternator bolt was very tight. 10mm long reach socket, 12mm long reach socket. I had to make this sort of concoction with a universal joint and an ordinary 12mm socket on the end to get it the right length, but in the end I found it was easy to use this socket, this ratchet, to make it a little bit longer. What would have been handy would have been a very short 3/8 extension bar. Otherwise you want 10mm spanner, 12mm ring spanner, 14mm ring spanner, 12mm spanner, and as I describe elsewhere, attacking it with a grinder is a very good idea so you don't get rounded off bolts, because it gives you a nice sharp biting edge. To be honest, with this job, before I was going to start this, if I'd have known, I would have gone off and got a 10, a 12 and a 14mm. These are sort of like B&Q spanners or some silver line ones or something, and do the same thing to all three of those spanners, grind the shoulder off. So you get rid of the beveled bit in there, it's much less inclined to slip. I'd call these Toyota spanners, I think. You could do the same thing to sockets, but in a couple of places you do need a spanner. Good size screwdriver, piece of wood, it's handy for levering things around. Pair of grips for pulling out the drain plug. You need torches. I had torches as well. Magnetic, picking up things. If I drop things once, I dropped them 100 times on this job, I'll tell you. And like I say elsewhere, it certainly batters your hands around a little bit, and I've got a bit of a cut on my arm back down there somewhere as well. Yeah, not the best. Right, well, we finally got the alternator off, and he's loose here. He's hanging on the cables, but you've got to be a little bit careful with that. And there's the connector right at the bottom, which there's a wire off the bottom of the alternator loom which has to go into that. You have to disconnect that. You just squeeze it and it'll pull apart. Now we've got all this out, you can see just what state the water pump is. So the next step is unbolting the water pump, and we'll see how we get on with that. Right, this is the new water pump, which fortunately comes with a new gasket. That's it there. It's Airtex one, all the way from Spain, so buenos dias if you're from Spain. I've sort of have a little compare as best I can the shape and size of it with what's in there, and you know, in case there's any silly mistakes before you start taking it apart and making it completely terminal. But it looks like the right thing. I have to say it looks completely different to all the other water pumps that are featured on other videos on YouTube. For starters, all the other Yaris ones seem to have a removable pulley, whereas this one's permanently fixed, which doesn't make it quite so easy to access those bolts lower down. So I think we'll be trying to get those from underneath. I have got the car jacked up a little bit on axle stands. So I think actually before I finally do this, the next thing to do is drain the radiator a little bit. There is a yellow drain plug you can see down there. A little bit hard to see. But you can pull that out and there is a little drain thing on the bottom. So put a little bit of a plastic pipe on it and drain it into a container and catch the stuff, because it's well, to a degree reusable, and also it's pretty toxic stuff. You don't want to be letting it drain to the ground. Right, I've put a piece of hose on the bottom of the radiator drain cock, which is the little yellow thing you can see down there. I think you can just about see the hose there. Oh, come back out. Make it all come out a little bit quicker. We're going to take the cap off. Hopefully most of it will drain out. You can catch it. Down in this here 5 litre plastic container. Oh, I must do something about those weeds. Pump pulley loosened, you can see where the spanner goes on that particular bolt. And this is a bit of a pain really, because all these bolts are buried down in there, and there's a mix of 10mm. This is heads of the bolts. 10mm head, there's 12s, and a 14 right at the top. Goodness only knows why, but there we go. Lots of swearing on this job, I tell you. And here you can see just how easily these bolts round off. They are quite soft heads, and we know why they're reduced size heads, because a 8mm bolt like this in the UK, a standard one you go and buy in a fixings place, I'll have a 13mm head on. These have all got 12mm heads, and they're dished. And I know why Toyota do it, and all the other manufacturers do it, because when you've made a million cars and millions of bolts, that little piece of missing metal winds up as tons. Also, you know, less weight of the car improves fuel economy and all that stuff, and less weight for it to be moved around in the first place, but they certainly can be a pain. In the end, I decided to take the belt tensioner off. That's the 2 bolts that hold it on, and when it's actually in situ, to detension it, you put a spanner on there, which you can just see down the back, and push on it. It's all sprung loaded, and you can push on it or pull it, I think, push it down, and it takes the tension off the belt. So that's how you get the belt off in the first place. But this job, I have to say, is being a right pain. Even with this in there, it's all still pretty buried in there. So I'll carry on and get the rest of the water pump off now, and see if I can manage to not cut myself as much as I have already. Finally, all the bolts out, and I can hear it leaking, starting to drip already. Put a screwdriver in and lever the water pump off, and there we go. Now you can see the old bearings pretty well had it there. Yeah, not very good, the old bearing, all gone. So the new one does look an exact fit. So put the gasket on, and I will smear the faces of this and the face of the engine with the old blue Hylamar there, which is just a slight insurance policy. I do like that. Never had anything leak when you've used that. Light, very light smear of Hylamar around the water pump faces, and I should pop the gasket on and do the same with that. It just takes out the slight imperfections in the machining. I'm no doubt there'll be somebody out there saying, "Oh, why'd you do that? I would never do that," whatever. But I've always used it, never had any problems with it. Used it on cars, motorbikes, outboard motors, whoosh, loads of other things, no problems. You just wipe the excess off, and if you're wondering what the red is on that cloth, that is my blood. Because boy, did I cut my hand earlier when one of the spanners slipped. Right, we've got all the bolts in now, and I've left them all fairly loose, so you know, it's much easier to get them in, get them started with the whole water pump loose. And also you shouldn't be tightening one down, you know, on one corner of it. You've got to sort of do them progressively, going in a sort of diagonal pattern, pretty much like you would if you would tighten a cylinder head down. I mean, at the end of the day, it's an aluminium part, and if you put a lot of stress on one side of it before you put any on the other, you may well crack it. So gently as it goes. The other thing is, I've always found it's a good idea to get all the bolts in, get them started, because I've had a few problems with pattern water pumps in the past. This one seems to be pretty good, with some of the holes being slightly undersized or slightly out of place, so I had to go around and open them all up a little bit. I had that on the RAV I used to have. Lots of fun that was. So now I'm going to tighten them down nice and snugly in a diagonal pattern. Right, I've got the tensioner fitted, and I'm going to put the alternator back in now, not forgetting to connect this terminal at the bottom here. Very important, because I think you might have a few problems and be difficult to reach. Right, I've got the spanner there planted on the tensioner, so you can push down on the spanner and move the tensioner. What I'll do in a minute when we've got the alternator in place is I'm going to wedge a piece of wood in here to keep it pushed down so it's got the maximum amount of slack. Put the serpentine belt or the drive bolt, whatever you want to call it, back on. There is the bottom alternator bolt there. He's obviously loose at this point. You've got to get him in and get him nipped up before you put the top bolt in. And obviously taking it apart is like the opposite of that. Take the top bolt out first, and the bolt that holds this bracket on the alternator, so it gives you a bit of slack in the cable. Yeah, take the top one out and then allow the alternator, prise the alternator away a little bit from the cylinder block, and you then be able to get access to that bottom bolt. Apart, that's the first bolt you need to undo. Take that one out of the bracket. I'm going to tighten it up now because I'm putting it back together. And there's the alternator top bolt there. He's got a screw in. And obviously when you take it apart, you take him out first, swing the alternator away from the cylinder block, and then you can just about reach that one in the bottom. Not the easiest thing, I have to say. Tightening that bottom alternator bolt, which is the right hand one of the two that you can see there, it's a 12mm bolt. You need a 3/8 drive ratchet and just the right length of well, in my case I used a long reach socket, wherever it's gone, long reach socket. Oop. And that ratchet was just right. When I was trying to do my snap-on ratchet there, didn't push it forward quite, it's quite so much, it's thicker, it's thinner. The ideal thing would be an ordinary socket with an extension bar, but all the extension bars I got are this kind of length. You need little tiny ones. Trust me, not an easy thing to do, lots of swearing and lots of battered hands as well.